The Nothing by Scott Lee Williams. Once upon a time, there was a man who lived in a small house on the edge of nothing. On one side of the house was the world, with its stars and rocks and roses and dogs and cities and people, and on the other side, just a few feet beyond his property, on what would be the right side if you stepped out the front door, was nothing. He would wake up in the morning, step outside, and sort of squint at the horizon, trying not to look directly at the nothing beside his house. Occasionally, by accident, or perhaps on purpose, some sickening joy in his gut singing out its siren song, he would let his eyes stray over towards the nothing. He would almost always regret this action. First, the color went away as one's gaze approached the edge. Green grass gone gray, blue sky bleeding, the branches of a tree that strayed over toward the border zone fading into haze. Then, closer to it, there was a sort of atomization, as if the seemingly unbreakable bonds that held matter in its accustomed shapes revealed themselves to be, after all, not all that solid. The colorless ground granulated into finer and finer bits of reality until, at the very boundary, a vague tide seemed to swim through the matter, ebbing and flowing with unfelt breezes. Beyond that was simply nothing, and this was the strangest thing of all. Looking into nothing wasn't like looking into something which was actually nothing. That would be something, and not nearly so hard to take. Darkness, chaos, even emptiness implies a container, a something in which the emptiness finds its shape. No, this nothing was an actual nothing, the visual equivalent of unconsciousness, an absence so total that it could not be looked at. The first time he did try to look, he awakened several hours later with no recollection of the intervening time and a catastrophic headache. He felt off after that for about a week. After a suitable interval to restore his courage, he decided to revisit his experiment. He felt queasy and excited at the same time, something like when, as a teenager, he found that box of pornography in his father's closet. He wondered at this feeling. He began by throwing things into the nothing, but the things would disappear only to appear shortly thereafter in the exact place they'd been earlier, just before he'd picked them up to throw into the void. If he'd torn up grass, the bare patch he'd created would be completely regrown when he visited it the next day. The rock he'd pried from the ground, exposed bugs and creepy crawlies slithering and scattering for cover, appeared to never have moved, even though he was quite sure there had been a divot of black soil where it now stubbornly lay buried. He found himself thinking about the nothing more and more. He would lie awake late into the night, staring at the ceiling, trying to see in the blind darkness of his room, wondering if that was what it was like in the nothing, knowing that it really wasn't. Then he would sneak outside to see if he could look at it directly without falling unconscious, but his eyes would slide right off of it, away from it. He supposed that it was an improvement over simply passing out. Sometimes, when he tried to talk to himself about the nothing, he would find himself lapsing into a mental silence, unable to form words of any kind. He would remain like this for days at a time, silently pacing his house, eating cereal, thinking thoughts that resembled the empty word balloons of cartoon characters that had yet to be given anything to say. Finally, he had to admit to himself that he was in love with the nothing. It was both a gradual thing and, once realized, complete and total, as love tends to be. He felt his heart burn for the emptiness of it. He idolized the way it asked for nothing, or rather, everything, while making no claims, giving nothing. He built a small shrine, first out of cups and an empty cardboard box, then using a length of fishing wire that he strung throughout one room and an elaborate web that glistened in the light. But finally he realized that any representation of nothing was actually something, and he found it so abhorrent that he tore the web down. He smashed the cups into pieces. He became, for a period of about a week, like those Muslim mystics who believe that the creation of images is blasphemy. He made a nuisance of himself, breaking into art galleries and shops and smashing things like statues of boxes of tea, defacing posters and paintings with a small knife he kept in his pocket for the purpose, until he realized that destruction didn't actually destroy anything. His little acts of vandalism, satisfying though they might be, still left the things themselves altered certainly, but existent. He felt his impotency in the face of being and despaired that nothing seemed not to grow or shrink or change at all. It was nothing, and it wanted nothing, while his own need grew and grew. So, on a cold, overcast fall day, he sat in his car, breathing the vague fug of fast food and stale cigarettes, listening to the engine idle and staring at the speedometer, so as to avoid accidentally looking into the nothing and passing out or losing his nerve. Finally, he applied steady pressure to the gas pedal and drove forward, resolved to give himself to the nothing completely. He found himself driving away from where he knew the nothing lay, the opposite direction he'd been going, with no memory of any intervening time. He stopped the car and sat in it for a few minutes, breathing hard and listening to the blood pound in his ears before slamming the car into reverse, throwing his arm over the back of the seat, even though he knew there was literally nothing behind him, and backing up. As he passed the edge of the nothing, he felt his eyes crossing, and then there he was again, backing out of the nothing, exactly as before. He felt a strange delight mixed with his despair. He'd been expecting to die, and finding himself inexplicably alive made his world seem much brighter. He felt oddly happy, manic almost. Over the next few days, his fascination grew. He envisioned lifting up the entire world, the crust of the earth where everything that he'd ever seen or known lived, and sliding it into the nothing, the way you'd slide an omelet from a frying pan onto a plate. He imagined it all disappearing into not being, into nothingness, and then reappearing again, everything exactly where it had been before, unchanged entirely, with no memory of what had occurred. Since the nothing needed nothing, was complete in its voidness, it would neither accept nor repudiate the noisy world of things. The things would simply continue to be, and the nothing would continue to not be. Forever. Perhaps this had already happened, and no one alive could remember it, having come through the nothing. Was he the same as he had been? He prodded his body, probing its fiercely extant limbs, feeling the softness of organs and elasticity of his muscles, the hardness of his ribs and hip bones. It all seemed correct and depressingly persistent. Had the nothing rejected him? Was his love to remain forever unconsummated? In a delirium of longing, one night he masturbated into his hand and snuck out of his house in the dark to drip the ropey white semen into the nothing. He watched it disappear, and then crouched there on the ground for a while, feeling the cold seep into him, speculating if he might die out there, frozen and alone, wondering where his sperm might show up tomorrow before going back into the house and falling into a dreamless sleep. He drank his coffee the next day, wondering if the taste was slightly off, but he found no concrete proof to settle the whereabouts of his fluids one way or another. A slight heaviness and ache in his balls was the only evidence of his dalliance. Sleep began to elude him. He did not shower, or shave, or eat. He sat in the darkest room in his house, more a closet than a room, with the lights out and his eyes open. Sometimes he cried, there in the darkness, until his face was wet. Finally, one night several weeks later, at the height of his fever, he went out to the nothing and cut himself with the same pocket knife he'd used to slash posters and paintings. The blood welled along the thin slice on the fatty side of his palm, and he was about to shove his hand into the nothing, an offering to his beloved, when he stopped. With his dull, stupid body on the something side of things, and his hand in the nothing, what would happen? He'd thrown himself into the nothing before with willful abandon, but this was something else. What if the nothing decided to claim the part of him that he put in? He imagined the emptiness of sensation. Then, pulling back a stump where his hand had been, he shivered. Wasn't this what he wanted, though? Didn't he still love the nothing? He was ashamed of his thoughts, of his cowardice, of his scientific attitude towards that which he claimed to adore. The cut throbbed on the side of his palm, and he was starting to shiver. He'd come out to the edge of the nothing, naked, as had become his custom since his interests blossoming into obsession. He squeezed the cut so that the blood dripped into his cupped palm. He tried to throw the blood into the void, then flicked it with the fingers on his opposite hand, little drops splattering into atomization and then absence. As expected, nothing happened. Finally, he steeled himself and thrust his left hand, the one with the cut, into the nothing. There was neither cold nor warm. His brain registered the presence and continuity of his body, except where his hand was in the nothing, up to his wrist. He pulled it out, and the hand almost seemed to reconstitute itself. He flexed his fingers and held it up in the light that fell from his front porch. He spent a few minutes thrusting the hand in and out of the nothing. In nothing, out remade, the same, cut and all, no different than a moment ago. This was unacceptable. Frustration and longing rose in his chest, choking him. Without thinking, he took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and shoved his face into the nothing as if he were plunging it into a basin of cold water. The close, accustomed darkness behind his eyes disappeared, and he lost consciousness. When he came to, it was day, and the nothing was gone. The field now extended out to the horizon, and some trees and a stream he'd never seen before acted as if nothing of import had happened. Above these, the sky unrolled, a perfect unbroken blue, entirely unconcerned. He lay there, staring at the sky, and then finally got up, brushed the black dirt off his white thighs and arms and chest, and went back into the house, where he lived, disconsolate and mourning, for the rest of his days. Scott Lee Williams lives, writes, and makes music in Brooklyn with his wife, a cat, and a dog. He grew up in Arizona, where he got his bachelor's degree in music, theater, and creative writing at the University of Arizona. He's happier in Brooklyn, though. The weather's better. You can find short pieces by him as part of an ongoing project called For Each Day at foreachday.blogspot.com.